both the DoD and the VA. While on active duty in the Navy, Captain Nash provided far-forward psychological health services to the 1st Marine Division at the Battle of Fallujah, for which he was awarded a Bronze Star. And he led the development of the current Navy and Marine Corps doctrine for combat and operational stress control, a critical element to how we develop the FOCUS program, learning from him, including its acknowledgement of moral injury and loss as important mechanisms of psychological injury. Dr. Nash has led or collaborated on research on risk and protective factors, new measures for early recognition, and new cognitive behavioral treatments for combat-related stress injuries. He served as a member of the Institute of Medicine's Committee for Assessment of the Effectiveness of PTSD Treatment in the DoD and VA, and he co-chaired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs High-Risk Behavior Working Group. He's co-authored 2 books, Combat Stress Injury and Adaptive Disclosure, a New Treatment for Military Trauma Loss and Moral Injury. And as I said, on a personal note, I first met Dr. Nash, I think 10 years ago, 9 or 10 years ago, a decade, at Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base when he was in uniform and having just, I think, returned from your time in Iraq, right?
That's correct.
We met, from the very first time I attended a meeting and he was there, I recognized him as somebody who just had a clarity and vision about the mission of serving Marines and their families. And I was lucky enough to continue that collaboration and contact. He invited me to come and speak at a Quantico meeting where they were developing the combat and operational stress control doctrine around military child issues. And I would say that from that very foundational time, Bill's been such a critical voice. He always speaks the truth and always leads the way. And it's so great to see him back with the Marines, actually, continuing this work. So we're really privileged to have him here as a colleague and a friend. So
Thank you. Thank you. What Tricia didn't tell you is how much she contributed to the Navy and Marine Corps' approaches to managing stress in the military and recognizing stress injuries, and not only in service members, obviously, but also in their families. But she was part of the process from the bottom up. So I feel like we've kind of grown up together. So this is my family. I feel like in some ways. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you're all interested in here. We've got a couple of first-class seats open here for those of you in economy, so I'll try not to step on your toes. So a lot to talk to you about and show you are some slides that I've developed over the last year and a half or 2 years maybe, largely from conversations like this. And every time I have a conversation with a group of people about moral injury, I make sure I have enough time to have a real dialogue and conversation, because I always leave smarter than when I came. And so the next people I go see will have some of your ideas on my slides. So that's a significant piece of what I'm going to talk about here, but because we have a particular interest here in families, I'm going to make sure we carve out time at various places to talk about how these ideas, concepts, practices apply to families in and out of the military. And I really think that is in some way, well, not in some ways, I believe that is a far more important place to have conversations about moral injury, to study it, to assess it, screen for it, prevent it, treat it, all those things. And I'll make the case for that as we go on. So you all probably are smarter about family care than I am. That's not one of my areas of particular expertise. So I'll be looking for your ideas as we go along. So, okay. So, moral injury as a concept is really as old as sin, literally. And its roots go very deep in theology, religion, a branch of philosophy called ethics, literature, art, mythology. I love movies, and one of the things I do recently is I'm trying to rewatch all the movies I've ever seen in my life, and looking for, you don't have to look hard, themes of moral injury and moral repair. And it's all over, right? War movies, movies about anything other than war, because these are themes that cut right to the heart of what it means to be a human being and to master the challenges we face as humans. So the only thing new in this whole landscape is now it's a subject for scientific study. But I think it's important for all of us to recognize that this science has no more and should have no more of a monopoly on the conversation than should religion or philosophy or anyone else. It's because all these are valid. We're talking about an experience that we all share. Are my sort of ad hoc definitions: moral injury, damage to a person resulting from a violent contradiction of deeply held moral expectations. And moral repair is rebuilding after a moral injury. Of course, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about through the course of the time we have is rebuilding what? How? We hope to get some granularity. But let's drill down a little bit more into this definition of moral injury. I just wrote these last night in the hotel. I'm not sure if they're right or clear even. Violent contradiction. People have asked me, what do you mean? Does that mean a violent act? Well, no. What I mean is you have to be bombarded somehow with information that is irreconcilable with existing schemas, existing concepts, and really deep understandings of who you are as a person and the world. Irreconcilable information. And deeply held moral expectations, non-negotiable requirements for behavior of the self and others in high-stakes situations. So, what is a high-stakes situation? The first person that used that phrase, high-stakes situations, with respect to moral injury was Jonathan Shea in Achilles in Vietnam, and he was talking about one particular moral injury, and that's the moral injury that he recognized in veterans whose leaders had made decisions in high-stakes situations that betrayed their trust. And I think that's an important piece, high stakes, because people, you can fail to behave and act the ways you think you should act in a situation that's going up the elevator or crossing the street, whatever, and you're not going to walk away with a deep wound. That's not going to derail your life. But in a high-stakes situation, it's another story. So let's talk about this. What are some high-stakes situations, and what makes them high stakes? And I'm really going to wait for somebody courageous out there to chime in and offer your thoughts about that. What are some high-stakes situations in life?
Well,
A shooting? So, just sort of trying to pull out from that, what about that makes it high stakes? There's life and death. So life and death situations are high stakes, right? Thank you. So that's a good example of a life and death situation that is because it's life and death. Yes? Right. So in a military operation, many of the things that service members are asked to do, required to do, may affect the survival of someone else, the health, safety, and survival of someone else. And that's not just in combat, obviously, because in combat, we may think of service members primarily being there to take lives, but the part of this, that their job in a combat that they're most invested in is protecting their fellows, their brothers and sisters, right? So their ability to protect the lives of their fellow Marine soldiers is definitely high stakes. But it's not just in combat by any stretch of the imagination, because peacekeeping missions, I mentioned in the our little case conference this morning about a friend of mine, Romeo Dallaire, who's a senator in Canada, who was the commander of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda in the 1996 genocide. And his job was to keep the peace. Obviously that was a high-stakes situation. Okay, so what are some other high-stakes situations? Yes? Yeah. Could you, is that a microphone? Could you say it again, please? And I'm not sure it's on. Okay. Oh, I see. So that's for you. That's for you. I'm sorry. Okay, so go ahead. Yes, please.
So with families with children with medical issues, the parents have big decisions to make, and they could be life or death decisions, or just, deciding what type of surgery your kid, what you're deciding on for your kid's life, or how aggressive you want a treatment to be.
Right. So a situation in a family where there's a child, where a child has an illness or an injury, and there are some medical care decisions to be made, where the life and well-being of the child is at stake. That's definitely a high-stakes situation. Yes. Did I get it? Okay. Yes.
I was going to say reputational situations where somebody, O.J. Simpson is on trial,
I would not have thought to say that, but I agree completely. Situations in which maybe not how you define yourself, but certainly how other people perceive you, but you can't help but somehow incorporate into your own self-definition, right? So another sort of category of high-stakes situations are those in which your identity is on the line. That if the outcome may not be the same person, I think we're getting close to some bedrock here. Yes. Right.
mortality as well.
Right. Needs of the many versus needs of the few. How do we allocate scarce resources, economics? Because, making decisions based on what is going to yield the greatest benefit for the greatest number, those people in the group that doesn't get resources.
The high-stakes situation also includes moral decisions, especially working with police officers in an undercover role. And
Yeah.
what happens when they're doing what they're making friends with suspects,
Oh,
and then later needing to testify against them. And I think there was a book written about an officer who was undercover with the Mongols, motorcycle gang,
yeah,
and he felt tortured by feeling very guilty. So that's
Right.
a huge dilemma.
yeah. And perhaps to make the link to something we just identified a moment ago, partly that's because in his undercover role, he was acting in ways and doing things that violated his own moral code, his own moral expectations, and his own identity. And is it possible to do something, to act in a way that conflicts with your identity without damaging your identity? What about families? Yes. Oh, right, right. And the reason that's high stakes is because of the enormous long-term negative consequences, not only for the child, but for the rest of the family and for society as a whole. Yes.
We talked a little bit about this morning, but I think in families in general, even beyond these more dramatic situations, being a parent is a high-stakes situation every day. And I would say, no, I mean, your job 24 hours is to protect your child. And so I think just being a parent in general is high stakes. And I would say the same for someone like a teacher. Anybody who's responsible for protecting someone that's vulnerable,
Yes.
it doesn't matter if it's a dramatic situation or not.
Yeah.
It's always high stakes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, because I definitely agree. And that's one of the perspectives that I was hoping to get at. I do think, yes.
I mean, yeah, if we're looking at a micro level, I think every committed dyad relationship,
Yes.
an irreversible betrayal
Yes.
that could affect greater people, whether it's adultery, one spouse doesn't know, or even in a military situation where, right now, where if the military person chooses to stay at combat and not come home, it's causing the person to have to choose the role of being in the military versus the role of being in the family, and the family can feel like that's a total betrayal, that you would
Right.
choose
Right.
that job over them.
Right.
And then if a divorce happens, the kids are then it just spirals to bigger.
Right. So, in parenting, and even in a dyadic relationship, a committed dyadic relationship, every moment potentially could be high stakes, and high stakes partly because your decisions and actions could have on your partner, but also what are the impact of those things on you? How does it change? And you may guess that from the title of my presentation and my use of the word identity here a few times, that I'm really thinking more and more that a high-stakes situation may be defined as one in which your identity is on the line, where your identity is vulnerable, and to the extent you define who you are by your ability to love in a dyadic relationship.
And how would you recover from the betrayal?
Yeah. Your own betrayal or the betrayal of your partner. Right.
Right, and how do you repair, if you're the person who's betrayed, and you're deeply held moral and do you forgive? Do you let that one go? Can you expect them to now be trustworthy after the fact? And how does it change that person's deeply rooted moral expectations?
Right, right. So I agree. So I don't know if this is smart, but I want to confess something to you all that I've never tried to do in any setting like this before. Partly I am engaged in the work I'm in because of one of my moral injuries, my own personal moral injuries of going to Iraq with the Marines in 2004, 2005, embedded in a ground combat unit where I did clinical work, but really my job, the reason I created the position, was for me to prevent PTSD, prevent suicide, prevent these negative outcomes. I failed. Now, it doesn't help for me to remind myself that no one else has succeeded, right? That is a high stakes situation because my identity on the line. That is what I agreed to do. That is what I, marshaled all my professional resources to do, and I failed. And so part of my own journey toward moral repair is having these conversations and researching moral injury. But the worst moral injuries in my life were not in my role as a psychiatrist in the military. They were in my role as a parent. I've been married 3 times, divorced 3 times. I have 4 sons by 2 marriages, and the last group of sons were 3, 5, and 7 when their mother and I separated. The youngest, Danny, who's 3, was a daddy's boy. We were very close, and I lived in San Diego. She moved up to LA to pursue an acting career, and though I tried to stay in their lives as a distant part-time dad, I failed. And I know he still doesn't forgive me. And I don't think my story is unique in any way. I mean, so parenting, I think, is one of the highest stakes situations a person could be in because so much of your identity is on the line, so much of who you are as a person and your value. And I think this is an area where, the moral injury idea has emerged in the military context, but not because that's where it's most prominent by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that's where the seed sprouted. It's one reason I'm really glad to have this conversation with you all, because I think we need to look beyond that, look at other. I mean, it's nothing new. I'm not, this is not something you don't already know. But, okay. So I just want to talk a little bit, tiny bit about some of the research. It's very young. This is the Moral Injury Event Scale, which is a 9-item questionnaire that we created as part of the Marine Resiliency Study, which was a prospective longitudinal study of ground combat Marines. We enrolled 2,600 of them and followed them through the course of an entire deployment cycle. And this is a scale not of moral injury as an outcome, but of events that might possibly be morally injurious. So it's kind of like an event, it's like a life event scale or combat exposure scale. It's just events. We validated it in our Marine population a group, the Bryans from University of Utah, in collaboration with military researchers, have since revalidated it in a population of clinical population in the Air Force and a non-clinical population in the Army Guard. We, in our study of it, found two primary factors, two subscales. In red is the perpetration scale, which is either I did something or I failed to do something, or someone I was with did something. And then there's the perpetration scale, these last three items, which are events in which I was the target of someone else's moral transgression. This last one, number 9, I feel betrayed by others outside the military, we put in there specifically to target family-related betrayals. This is just to show you part of our validation of this moral injury event scale in our Marine cohort was looking at to what extent did responses on the moral injury event scale predict PTSD symptom severity. And we compared the ability of 5 different exposure scales to predict which Marines had, in red, full PTSD symptoms, in orange, partial PTSD, or yellow, low symptoms of PTSD. And most people expect combat events to be the strongest predictor. But and this was just a small subset, one company basically, 200 Marines, but highly combat exposed Marines. Among very highly combat exposed, where sort of everybody in the unit saw a lot of combat events did not predict symptom level, nor did aftermath of battle, which is, seeing body parts and those kinds of things, perceived threat, which is I really thought I was going to die, that kind of thing, life and family concerns. The only types of events that significantly discriminated were moral injury events. And this is also from a Marine Resiliency Study data, a paper that we have in press right now, where we did a multivariate regression looking at pathways from 3 different types of events: perpetration and betrayal, moral injuries, and just traditional combat exposure. And when we included peritraumatic dissociation, guilt and shame and anger as moderators, when we included them in the model, we found no significant direct pathway from combat to PTSD, from betrayal to PTSD, or from perpetration to PTSD. So all of the significant pathway was via the moderators of anger, peritraumatic dissociation, guilt, and shame. Yes?
My husband's Israeli, and then Israel I was and I talked about this a lot with him, and kind of when we're talking about it, when they come out of whatever combat situation, or everyone has been through that. Their parents, their cousins, and it just creates such a different culture. And I because everyone understands and they don't feel like they're coming back to something that nobody understands and they can't talk about because it's completely an acceptable part of the culture.
Right. And that could be, that massively shared experience could be a huge protective factor. And I know that's how the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, sees that. I'm aware that your husband's okay. Well, what I think is we don't know enough to know how much to believe that. I've visited the IDF and saw how they operate. I mean, it's so different from anything here. Everybody goes home at the end of the day. right? Which is both a protective factor, but also a risk factor. It's kind of like the risk that our drone pilots have of driving to work, operating a drone, kill some people, then go home to my daughter's birthday party. Oh. And the ground combat element of the IDF claim they have very, very low rates of PTSD. But then again, some of the greatest, the best PTSD researchers in the world are in Israel. So I don't know. I don't know. It's complicated. Yes.
My background's actually in biostatistics. I have a joint appointment in psychiatry, but in biobehavioral science, but I'm not a psychiatrist. But I would sometimes describe, I've heard my advisor describe statistics as the science of thinking backwards. and I would like to just point out, if you're thinking backwards, if you have a patient in front of you with PTSD, and I've seen, I think one of the reasons I'm here is that I've seen it where someone who cares greatly about a patient has a theory that it relates to the patient's
Yes.
own perpetration,
Yeah.
which is a possible pathway, but where the patient has felt betrayed, and it's the pathway, and that the errant, it would be like a, what do you call it, projective identification by the therapist onto the patient and missing having the false.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's like,
So,
no statistics, really? Yeah, yeah.
what do you think?
No, I, and I think that's one of the values of this sort of research. It's limited because, we included these variables because of our preconceptions, because of our prejudices, because of what we expect. God knows what we didn't include that we're just not aware of. But it does kind of open the aperture a little bit, make you think about other possible pathways.
Not jumping to conclusions. One theory that there
Yes.
remains
Yeah.
so that there could be differential diagnosis.
And these things could be co-occurring. And I want to get to you in a second, but I just want to say that one of the things that I'm excited about, encouraged by this research and others like it that I'm involved with, is because it gives us targets for an intervention. People don't come into us saying, I felt betrayed or I did something bad. But they do come in because their lives are derailed because of guilt, shame, and anger in particular. Peritraumatic dissociation is really kind of hard to see that in current life. But it gives us targets for indicated prevention. Yes, you.
Well, you may have just touched on it. My question was whether the previous slide would suggest that it's the people who are experiencing moral injury that need to most get into treatment. And my question was whether there's any data on who's most likely to seek treatment, and whether if you have a moral injury,
Oh.
you're less likely to seek treatment because then you're going to have to talk about the very thing you don't want to talk
Wow.
about. Where if it's fear-based, talk about. So
That's a very good question. I don't have an answer. I haven't seen anyone research that question, study it. I'm very encouraged that the emerging, growing conversation about moral injury and the attempts by people in the clinical care world to develop targeted treatments for it is encouraging. That in the future, it may be more likely for people with moral injury to. I know veterans are going to their VA medical centers and saying, I have moral injury, what do you have for me? And in a few places, they say, come, we've got something, But a lot of places, like Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what? So I don't know. There have been studies of looking at the categorizing index events as a life threat, a loss, moral injury. And the current gold standard for event categorization in VA and military is, I think they've got 6 different categories. You know, moral injury self, moral injury other, loss, I forget what the other ones are. And the one that we used to think accounted for all of them, life threat, is like less than a third, even among combat veterans. And then if you throw in sexual assault and hosts of other, unfortunately, very common experiences where life threat may not be an issue, it's very common. Yes.
Since there's such a high dropout rate from fear-based
Yes.
exposure treatments
Yes.
like PE, are there data to suggest that the people who either drop out or who are non-responsive common treatment models, that they're more likely to have moral injury? Has people done those analyses?
That I'm aware of. I wish we had those data because I believe that to be true, but I don't have evidence of it. There are some people in the VA and also in DOD researching barriers to care, dropouts. The dropout rate for evidence-based trauma therapy among veterans and service members is just enormous. And even those who complete with PE or CPT, I forget what the numbers are, Brett Litz and Charles Hogue and a few other real top dogs in the field did a sort of a meta-analysis recently looking at, well, what are the outcomes for these gold standard treatments? And they're really, for things for military-related trauma, it's poor. I think something like, certainly less than a half can be said to be anywhere near in remission, and a significant percentage still meet criteria for the disorder. So, and we think that's one of the reasons. And you think about if your one of your main symptoms is guilt and shame over a perpetration, and I ask you in prolonged exposure to tell this story in vivid graphic detail over and over and over again, at some point you're going to punch me in the nose, right? Because every time you do, rather than feeling safer or more forgiven, which is really the crux of the matter in moral injury, is to find forgiveness, you know, I can't give you that as a therapist. And asking you to tell this story, and what's that term? Memory reconsolidation, right? Every time you recall a memory, you're actually modifying the memory and restoring it. And every time you recall it and feel more shame, the next time you're going to recall it, it's going to be worse. You're creating a monster. And that process explains why a lot of these things get worse over time. Yes?
Yeah, I just had a question. I've sort of been trained that people committed something that might be considered a war crime or something that might be a cause for, not necessarily just something that might be a cause for moral injury, but war crime type events that you don't do CPT and PE with, and that they're not as effective if someone is a perpetrator versus a victim. But my question is more, do we have an idea who is more susceptible to having moral injury? You may have 2 or 3 veterans, each with different temperaments and characteristics coming in, participating in the same event, but not all 3 might come out with moral injury. Do we have an idea about characteristics that contribute?
I'm sorry to say, not only that I don't have the answer to that, but I'll be honest with you, that I'm really uncomfortable with the question.
Yeah.
Not coming from you in this setting, but to ask that question in a policy setting. The reason is we did a pretty large reanalysis of marine suicides, looking at characteristics and risk factors, and we did a sort of a meta-analysis of studies that have looked at risk and protective factors in military populations. We're still doing a big data analysis. And the prejudice is, the assumptions of a lot of military leaders is that they believe the strongest predictors were things that pre-existed. Military service, you know, early childhood experiences, genetics, personality traits. You know, that, as I said in the case conference, you know, they believe that this piece of pottery cracked because it had a little hairline fracture in it already, and it wasn't so. But when you look at what studies have looked at effect sizes, even though it's hard to compare different studies and nobody's done a big enough one to be able, you know, whether it's suicide or depression or PTSD or whatever else, certainly all those things are risk factors, all those things are vulnerabilities, they all contribute to the outcome. I'm not sure that across the board the effect size is all that great, right? And here's the thing I keep saying over and over again. If we're not sure how much of this problem is from early life experiences or pre-existing personality or recent life events or current social supports or lack thereof or treatments or lack thereof, if we're not sure what the truth is, we have a moral obligation to lean toward the explanations that do the least harm. I know the ones that do the most harm are the ones that give people the message that it's your fault, that you're in this mess because you came in broken, that it isn't a matter of life not providing you the resources you need to meet your challenges, but it's you don't have resilience. And that's one reason that word, even though I use it, I didn't start it. Makes me crazy because people think of it as a characteristic of the individual, right? But I think it's useful if we think of it as the influx, the flow of resources to meet current needs, and maybe we all have, you know, a certain, we all have a bucket of stored resources, right? That enable us, you know, feeling loved, feeling understood, education, knowledge, health, I mean, all these things. But when that bucket runs out, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how great your life was. So I don't know. I don't even know how we got on this, but so those are important questions. I feel like I want to tread very lightly there.
I appreciate that nuance, and I'm not saying it as a way of it's your fault, but that we do have, there is variety in temperament
Yes.
and character.
Yes.
And there are going to be people who, you know, just like every child has a different experience in the same family system.
Yeah.
You know, there can be a hot event or an event.
Right.
And each person is going to have a different experience.
Right.
And take something different out of
You're right.
that shared experience.
You're right.
And do we have any idea about these vulnerabilities?
Those are valid questions. You know, some of my own anecdotal experience about that. I had the difficult but very enlightening opportunity to interview about 25 Marines at 29 Palms in California some years back, like within a few days of returning from a horrible combat deployment in Afghanistan. And I interviewed them on video, on camera, because I was going to use some clips for part of a training that I never did because what they told me was just far too brutal. But so I heard like 20 some times some of the same stories told over and over again through different people's eyes. And some of them were clearly very damaged by the experiences, others less so. And just from that little small n anecdotal kind of experience, wisdom, faith, the ones who could say, you know what, I'm leaving it to God to sort out. It's not, not taking. So I guess in a more categorical, general way, what meaning the individual assigns to an event, and that's a moving target, right? Meaning, which is one of the reasons moral injury can be a very delayed onset process, because your understanding of the meaning of an event can change over time. So, maturity, wisdom, intelligence, I think those probably aren't surprising. Yes?
CPT not really showing the results we expect. Why are the VAs pushing for these modalities and saying this is the cure, this is, making this person better?
Well, I can give you several answers to that question, but I'm going to give you the mature one. They're the best we have in terms of science, not in terms of effect size of outcomes, certainly not in military populations. Even in non-military populations, the effect sizes aren't great. But still, there's a lot of things that are pretty much on a par with the effectiveness of PE and CPT, EMDR, a whole host of non-evidence-based treatments have been shown in randomized trials to really do about the same, but nothing's been better. So, and because of the way this is funded, if you weigh the number of studies, put them on a scale, the studies that have the most weight are PE and CPT. And so when, the VA and the military decided we need to provide evidence-based therapies for our clients and patients, they would naturally gravitate toward those things. They've spent a good deal of money trying to reach them in military populations, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked to the point of not even being able to complete the studies because of high dropout rates. Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I'm going to talk about meds a little bit later. I think, medications have an important role, but a more narrow role to address certain of the subsets of symptoms. But in terms of really addressing the underlying problem, I'm not sure that they. So anyway, great discussion. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, going to make a case for you here, and this is theory. This is conceptual. It's based on, I'm going to show you where these ideas came from. I didn't make them up. And I'm going to make the case that what is damaged in moral injury is the core self, the identity. And one important reason to ask this question, what is damaged actually in moral injury, is because the answer to that question is going to drive the next important step in research. That is creating tools for assessing for the severity and existence of moral injury, right? What are you assessing for? We've got the moral scale, but that just means you think you lived through an event morally injurious, not that it was, right? Our team, Brett Litz in Boston and his folks, and he's recruited a team of researchers in Australia and some others in the United States. We've come to the conclusion that identity is the right target. It's really hard to define and conceptualize in an empirical way exactly what we're talking about, but we've decided that this construct encompasses the maximum amount of what we think we know. And so to make it any more narrow would be to miss the boat. So I'm going to talk about 6 different facets of identity that I think are each clearly affected by moral injury: emotional repertoire, relationships, self-concept, concept of the world, authority over oneself, and continuity over time. I'm going to go through these in a little bit of detail. When do we go till? 10? 11:30? Okay, good. Okay, so what are the facets of moral injury? So for the first facet, I appeal to ancient scripture. This is from Genesis, where after Cain killed Abel, and he responds to the Lord and says, "You have driven me away from the soil, and I am hidden from your face." Those are key components of the moral injury experience that I think appear over and over again in our shared experiences of moral injury. Social isolation, being an outcast, and needing to hide. And if you think about what we're hardwired to express, the feeling of shame, hiding one's face is a very common experience. Here's another version of it from Euripides' play called Heracles, about Hercules. And in this version of Heracles, Euripides tells the story of Heracles coming back from his 12 trials, coming back to his home and his wife and his 2 sons and his stepfather. His real father is Zeus. But he comes home to greet his family and go through the ritual purification ceremony that they called catharsis, which was they would have a basin in the home over which members of the family would wash the hands of the warrior to wash away the moral stain that they called miasma. So while Heracles was at the basin in his home with his family and they were washing his hands, he had a dissociative flashback. And in that moment, thought his wife and children were enemies, and he attacked them. And somehow he was subdued and tied up to pillars in the home. And when he came back to his senses and saw the devastation around him, he said, "Well, where's my wife? Where are my sons?" And when they told him what he had done, this is how he responded. Once again, needing to hide, feeling like one is contagious. In fact, the idea of moral contagion was very much a part of the ancient Greek idea of moral pollution, and that it was considered really altruistic and for the greater good that if you were one of these morally polluted people, you needed to get away. You needed to protect other people from you. Does that sound familiar? It does to me. I know I have seen and heard that in many people. So that gives me the first two facets. These negative moral emotions of shame, guilt, anger, contempt, but also I think there's a simultaneous loss of ability to experience positive moral emotions of joy, awe, honor, and social alienation. Loss of trust, disconnection, feeling contaminated, feeling unforgivable. Forgiveness is a social act, even if it's self-forgiveness, I think. And I think it's the important social that decides what is forgivable. Okay, so for the next, Ronnie Janoff Bowman, some of you probably are familiar with her work. She did research and wrote this book on shattered assumptions, and she postulated that trauma could be defined as events that shattered these three necessary assumptions. And those three necessary assumptions are the self is worthy, the world is benevolent, and the world is meaningful, right? That I am good, the world is a good place, and life has meaning, it's not just random chaos. So in her view, and I think it fits very nicely in terms of other experience, so damaged self-concept, feeling like I'm no longer feel good. I no longer feel trustworthy. There's this great movie I used to watch with my sons over and over again, Never Ending Story. Have you ever seen it? Yeah, a couple people. So it's this fantasy about this, the nothing is overtaking this fantasy world, and there are these talking animals in there, and one of the talking creatures is this thing called a rock biter. Huge, massive, like a mountain, with legs and arms, and as the nothing is invading and sucking out everything that exists, he grabs onto his friends with these massive rock hands, and he tries to hold them and keep them from being sucked into the nothing, and they slip through his fingers. And there's this follow-on scene where he's sitting there looking at his hands, and he says, I used to think these were good, strong hands. Kid stories, And damaged concept of the world. Not only, loss of faith in God, but loss in a belief that good and evil are really meaningful concepts, that right and wrong really exist, that life has purpose. Okay, so for the next facet, it took me a while to track down the origins of Erik Erikson's concept of identity crisis. And most people are familiar with that in terms of adolescence and almost a normative process of development. But actually, he first coined the term in his work with veterans after World War II in New York, and shell shock victims. And I had there in red sort of bold, pull out some of his statements, that these were people who had lost a sense of personal sameness and continuity over time. And at the same time of this loss of this predictable sense of who they were, they also lost some of their control over themselves, the authority over themselves. That these things in his experience kind of went hand in hand. And he called, loss of inner agency. And so he saw that as a lack of, using psychoanalytic ideas, a loss of ego identity. So he didn't see this initially as a normal process, but a pathological one of individuals who were maybe a little bit beyond the stages of adolescence where that kind of, maybe not, where those kinds of trying on different identities and kind kind of having some fragility in that regard, had, because of their experiences, had suffered damage to their identity. And some of that is echoed in Judith Herman's work, her descriptions of complex PTSD, which in her experience was in people who were ritually, repetitively abused, or were in concentration camps or something like that. But difficulties in affect regulation, she certainly, difficulties in authority over oneself. This is definitely not part of the PTSD construct, although you could kind of think some of the hyperarousal symptoms. In fact, you could really make an argument that a lot of those symptoms are loss of authority over memory, right? If you have intrusions of memories, loss of authority over behavior, but the fear-based model of PTSD is kind of steered away from those things, even though the earlier descriptions of them, like the post-Vietnam syndrome, rape trauma syndrome, clearly they were more highlighted. And of course, Jonathan Shea really made strong argument in Achilles in Vietnam, what he called the undoing of character, which is, and his writing about this was one of the things that was most influential in the conversation we had in the Navy and Marine Corps in trying to figure out what are the kinds of events that can lead to a stress injury, and realizing that moral injury was one of them. So, loss of self-regulation, inability to calm down, loss of self-control, outbursts, and loss of continuity over time. One of the complaints family members have had about service members coming back from war zone deployments forever has been, he's not the same person, right? And I'm not sure what we used to think that meant, but I now think it means they are not the same person. They really are not the same person. So the idea is that aspects of moral injury, features of moral injury, can be understood as occupying these 6 facets of identity. And so we're working on an instrument for assessing moral injury based on this construct and based on some of these components of it. But let me just go through each of the 6 and just talk about, with the time we have left, fortunately we've got a good amount of time, talk about how might we address each of them. Because I really think an optimal approach to care, whether that be in a professional clinical setting or in the family, in the community, wherever, I think it's helpful to think about what can I do about this facet and about this facet and this facet, and not limit ourselves, as unfortunately I think some treatments have, to just self-concept, for example. Cognitive processing therapy really tends to narrowly look at self-concept as one piece of this. Okay, so I'm pulling out self-regulation first, because I really think this is the most important one to address first. Without the neurons in the brain and the body to do their job appropriately, without adequate sleep, without reducing the level of inflammation, without stopping ongoing panic attacks or rage outbursts or other experiences that actually fry more neurons, without putting out that fire, we have probably little hope of doing something constructive with the rest. So sleep. This is a place where psychopharmacology has the most important place to encourage sleep, to reduce panic attacks and anxiety level and but I as a physician, a psychiatrist, I have obviously because of the way healthcare is funded and the amount of time I have as I used to have when I was doing it to do clinical work, I couldn't focus as much on some of these other important tools. But I'm certainly learning now from research and other people's experience, exercise, diet, many other things promote the biologically based recovery of self-regulation ability. Yes?
With women veterans, we're seeing a lot of MST. We're doing groups with them and encouraging self-regulation first before the support group, and they're saying that's very effective. They said they
Good.
go to some of the support groups and feel triggered hearing stories. What do you do, though, when you are doing that and someone brings up a moral injury? I'm not sure how to handle that in the context of that group. It's happened a couple times where once on the military base where a gentleman brought up that people died under his command, and he was told he was responsible and he feels responsible. And another time, Dr. Barlett, are you in here? Yes. Remember when we were doing the group and the woman said her daughter, you were doing the group and the woman said her daughter attempted suicide, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so we've had it a couple times where I think Lauren handled it masterfully. I think I wanted to be God and say you're absolved of all guilt, and that.
Let me know how that works for you.
But you're teaching regulation, doing things like that. That comes up
Yeah.
in the group context. The group can respond as well, and they do appropriately. But how do you respond?
Yeah. Well, in the terms of self-regulation or in the terms of man. See, because I really think, if someone discloses that sort of information in a group setting, I don't know, it'd be interesting to try to imagine empathically what they're looking for, and it may be just simply asking to have their hands ritually washed, right? But without any unrealistic expectations that this ritual washing is actually going to unring the bell or really help them do the hard work that needs to be done to make amends, to work toward forgiveness. The group can't forgive them. You can't forgive them. You're not the only one. So, yeah, my thought is you obviously you wouldn't want them to leave that group feeling even more alienated and isolated. That's the greatest risk in my mind, is you have to figure out some way to validate the experience and, But at the same time, sort of marking the spot. Say, you have done something courageous here and something important to identify this and to say it. And let's have another conversation about it, because now we have to talk about what are the steps toward. And we're going to talk about some of them going forward. Does anyone else have other thoughts about what would go in toward promoting healthy brain functioning and self-regulation, those kinds of things? Yes.
One thing I was thinking was turn it off. Because sometimes with our patients, they start arguing with themselves, in their head, even about what they should be doing when they're having these panic or rage. And just not even trying doing that part. There's a way to get up, go somewhere else, or just a simple. Yeah.
CBT kind of.
Yes. Yeah, so that's excellent.
Argue with themselves about putting out the fire.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I'm not smart about cognitive behavioral sorts of tools for these sorts of things, but I know they exist. Obviously, there's a CBT for insomnia. I'm sure there are for others, and I probably should include that there. Thanks for mentioning that. I'm just not smart about it. Yeah. Oh, not worrying about putting out the fire. Yeah, actually, that's probably a terrible metaphor, because if there's a fire burning, it's like, oh my gosh, right, there's only one possible good outcome, and that's you put out the fire. But the truth of this is, yes, you can't. And the severity of these symptoms wax and wane over time, and good days, bad days. I think it's very sensitive to stress load. And I think that's an important piece of this too that we often ignore in isolation. But you're right, putting out the fire is probably, I think about that in terms of inflammation in the brain and central nervous system. But we don't want them to think that their brain is on fire, because, that's bad. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Excellent. Good. Excellent. Dialectical behavioral therapy sorts of skills. Back there?
Thinking about family processes, that there could be, when the family knows a little bit about this, their routines can be stronger,
Yeah.
their communication can be stronger, it sort of impacts a lot of this, just the family.
Oh,
And of course, impacts a lot of what we do.
yes, absolutely. It focuses bullseye in that regard. Yes, did you have yes, you had a comment.
Neurolinguistic programming.
Oh, okay.
The person can come up with all sorts of resources when they're in a state of calm that they could use when they are not in that state.
Right.
And it's almost gestalt in the way that it's affected. That they can imagine what they would need, and as the situation progresses, they would have different resources that they could give to themselves that they'd already come up with, so they could trust their own resources.
Great.
So it's a kind of communication of a healthy, not necessarily forgiving or loving side of themselves, working with the other side of themselves to integrate.
Thank you. So neuralistic programming, another excellent tool. Well, thank you. Those are very helpful. Okay, so next, targeting self-concept. And as I said, this is an area where cognitive processing therapy has done a lot with addressing cognitive distortions and overgeneralizations and black and white thinking, and those are things that are all important. My own bias, both as a clinician and as a member of a military and veteran community, is I think taking action and doing something always takes precedence over thinking through it. I think, and it's a cultural difference that many of us in the mental health profession believe that we can change the way we feel and the way we believe just by changing our thoughts, which is kind of the bedrock assumption of cognitive psychology. But I'm not sure that it works that way. Certainly not always. And I believe that action, doing something, can have much more powerful effect on emotion, physiology, and then secondarily affect the way we think. In moral injury, I think, we talked some in the case sort of making a list of all of the individuals or agencies who bear responsibility for any given negative outcome, including oneself, assigning a percentage responsibility to each of those individuals or agencies, God, President of the United States, all the way down to me. So, and really getting some help doing that, because that's a really hard thing for one person by themselves to to be objective about. But then once you do that, you say, okay, so my responsibility for this, shooting this pregnant woman, whatever, is 12%, 15%. What can I do to make amends for that? It's like you can't unring the bell, you can't turn back time, but the only real lasting antidote for evil is creating goodness. And you can't just talk yourself into it, because that's a moral trap. That's moral reassurance. That's the way you would necessarily explain moral injury to a young child. You would tell them aren't necessarily true because that's what they need to hear, because they're not capable of understanding the truth. But if we're dealing with grown-ups, they need to take responsibility, right? And the real culpability is seldom 0 or 100, somewhere in between. And so for those things that are my responsibility, I have to do something to make amends, even if it's symbolic, even if it takes the rest of my life. And for those things that I moral responsibility of others, I should seek amends. Anyone have any thoughts about this? Yes.
Again, outside of the professional, but as a reader of the Ask Amy column, which is where I learned a lot and gained a lot. But there was one time when I wrote Amy, I didn't hear back, but the case was written by a friend whose friend was ruminating because her son had died. It was ruled a suicide, but she thought it was a murder by the girlfriend.
Oh.
And Amy's first comment was, "This is an and the friend is now going crazy because every time she gets together with her friend, the friend talks about why it's murder, and it's damaging their friendship. So it's having adverse consequences now for the friend. And the friend is asking Amy for help. And Amy says, first, it's an example of how trauma reverberates. I thought it was a beautiful image. And then she said, don't count on her ever getting over the fact that it was a suicide, or I don't know if she used the term fact, but she basically bought into the authorities, ruled it a suicide, and then she ended with a lovely comment about don't give up on your friend. But my comment was, how did Amy, who didn't have any of the facts, know that it was a suicide? I mean, that it could have been just a snap judgment. It might have been correct, but it might have also been wrong. And the friend is ruminating because she knows a lot more about that story. And so I very much like your align with a benevolent moral authority. I suggested to Amy she could have left out her whole middle thing from a vantage point of technical neutrality. She could have just left
So
out
you're QAing Amy, basically. Yeah.
trying to.
Yes.
But I also said, but the moral authority I saw in your biblical reference was, I said, sometimes we can't achieve justice on earth.
No.
That was, like if you're, but don't undermine by buying into a potentially false assumption by the authorities that was just potentially snap judgment for their convenience that they didn't have the resources to sort it all out.
Right.
So,
Well, thank you for that, and I appreciate your linking that to the point about moral authority, which can be benevolent and could also be toxic. And so there are several sets of challenges here, but one of them is finding a moral authority that is benevolent. And in adaptive disclosure, which is the treatment that Brett Litz and his team created, that we're still undergoing a randomized clinical trial in San Diego. They use a kind of Gestalt technique of empty chair and asking the individual to imagine a benevolent moral authority, whether it's some real that someone that really has their back, someone that's wise and would never want to hurt them, and have a conversation with that imagined person. So did. This is what happened. Then imagine what would that person say back to you. I think a lot of our clinical treatments that are applied to moral injury assume that the patient or client sees the clinician as a benevolent moral authority, and neither parts of that may be true. We are not moral authorities, right? If in those cases where they perceive the person as a benevolent moral authority, and if that person is not ham-fisted in their, really learning about what's the truth here, how complex is it, and not just whitewashing, not just doing moral reassurance like you would with a child and thereby just delaying the detonation of this bomb, it could be very useful. But I think that's one of our challenges is, are we the best people to be moral authorities? And do we recognize when we're not perceived as that, we have no hope of saying, oh, it wasn't your fault? Well, how the hell do you know? How the hell do you know? Okay. Who do they? Some evoke Jesus or God or a prophet or some spiritual figure. Some evoke, drill instructor or some, really good leader they had in their past. Some it's a grandparent or that kind of thing. And some flat out can't do it, which is, I can't imagine what a benevolent moral authority would be. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. I love the rowing idea. And there are, fortunately, a lot of creative people testing, evaluating, promoting different kinds of shared activities. A friend of mine runs a Wounded Warrior camp for Marines in Pennsylvania, and they come up for a week at a time, and it's kind of an outward bound kind of thing, and rope, all kinds of activities. There's equestrian, horse, animals, surfing while stoned, surfing while straight, But I think activities, shared activities, I think are huge. And I would say for families too. You know, I think it's the same kind of nonverbal communication. The power of those nonverbals is as even more important in families. So, concept of the world. How do you change that? If someone feels like, I used to think the world was populated by good people who were basically not going to hurt me, not going to hurt each other. I used to believe right and wrong meant something. How do you fix that? It's a tough one. But I think at the end of the day, our shared moral covenant, moral force field in which we all live and work and raise our children and solve our problems is our shared responsibility. And that it is therefore on all of us every minute of every day to reinforce, to correct and repair moral transgressions, right? Justice, make things right. And that's an easier conversation to have in the military because of their core values. You know, they go, of course. I think it's a harder conversation to have in some other communities where some other parts of our cultures where the whole good-bad thing is a little fuzzier. So anyway, make the world a better place. Any other thoughts about how to try to repair concepts of the world? It's a tough one, but yes.
Maybe you could have people who believe that the world is a better place speaking with each other and presenting those ideas, and have several people who don't believe that, who just listen
Yeah.
to all of those people who still hold those values.
Yeah.
And the cognitive dissonance would probably be very hard, but at the same time, at least the person would realize that there are people that still believe.
Yeah. Yes, that's a good idea. You know, in my own clinical experience and life experience, I'm not sure the extent to which changes in worldview are because worldviews have been disproven by events, or how much those new negative worldviews are embraced as a defense against, you know, some other, you know, experiencing even worse moral emotions and distress. You know, if you can just say, okay, so the world sucks, it's a terrible place, nobody loves each other, so I'm cabin in the mountains, or worse, I'm going to go, you know, rob 7-Elevens and kill people. So I don't know how much, but I think this facet of moral injury may respond more to social. Here in a second. Yes. Well, we are. Okay. All right. Let me just rock it through here. Moral emotions, mindfulness, meditation, being able to just tolerate, experience the negative moral emotions, acceptance and commitment therapy, social alienation. I think this is huge. I said earlier this morning that's the success stories I've heard about people who've had a significant moral injury and were able to kind of build a new identity and come out fairly whole and hopeful. It's often, if not only, because experiences with someone who genuinely loved them, was able to listen to all these things and not whitewash it and go through the journey with them, which is tough, and then reassure them, I still love you, and for them to be able to internalize that. I think that is absolutely the most important piece of this. So, Thank you so much for sharing your ideas and this conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate what you said. I'm a psychologist with LAPD.
Oh.
And what you just did is so interesting. Would you be interested in talking to us with the LAPD? Do you have a number or a card?
Well, I'm in DC. I'll give you a card here.
Okay.
If you fly me out, I'll be happy to do that.
That would be fantastic. One other quick question for you. My son is very interested in starting up a nonprofit. He'd like to do it for money, but he doesn't know how. He's very interested in events. He's had quite a few friends go to Iraq and everything. He himself, because of his mother, didn't let him go, but whatever, that's a whole other story. He wanted to start like a foundation where he helps them assimilate back into the world, kind of get them a dog if that's what they need, but assist with them. Can he contact you and talk about his
Sure.
ideas?
I don't know. I'm not smart about how to do a foundation.
Battle buddies, maybe you could just direct him to people who have something, because he's a genius, he's very smart, his mother, but, his name is Jared Pavlov, Dr. Pavlov.
Okay.
Remember
Oh,
the
yeah,
dogs?
sure.
So he's Jared.
Okay,
And
good.
I'm going to absolutely...
Well, sure. Give him my email and tell him to write me.
And maybe you can just put him in a direction because,
I'll try.
I don't, battle buddies, something, because there are people at the VA kind of does it, but not what he's talking about. It really has a unique swing on it.
Good.
And I think it's going to be good. Okay, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Are these slides available?
Excellent.
Thank you.
My sense in the.
I don't think so, but I think they'll find out. I was
Spiritual injury, which is really important.